Hello there, welcome back to the channel. My name's Vince, I'm a composer, and in this video I wanted to talk about the topic of managing volumes in the context of composing music in Logic Pro. This is part of an ongoing series where I talk about some of my favourite ways to use Logic software. And so the area of how to control a volume is one of those things that, because there are so many different ways and approaches how to do it, so many ways to seemingly just do the same thing in Logic, I found it a little bit confusing and a bit overwhelming when I first started using the software. And so this video I'm making now is an attempt to kind of clear some of the confusion and give you some of the tips and advice and ways of thinking about it that I wished somebody had given me when I was starting out. So without further ado, let's jump into Logic. So the first thing I want to talk about is setting an appropriate monitoring level. And this just is more of a thing that will prevent mistakes down the line, prevent things getting too hot, as they say, too loud in the mixer and clipping. And it also just stops you from chasing your tail a bit, just makes the whole experience of composing and mixing a bit more predictable. And so basically the idea is you want your monitors to be set at a level where when the track is really cooking, you know, when you start to get to the exciting part of your track, it feels nice and satisfying through your monitors, and you're using that kind of, the emotional response you get from hearing that is kind of feeding your creative decisions. It also means that when you look at faders and they're registering a certain level, you have a kind of link between how that looks and how that sounds. That can be sometimes quite helpful. Similarly with how big waveforms appear and that kind of thing. Here's a track that is, you know, very work in progress. It's one of those tracks that just has a big kind of build towards the end. So let's just jump into it here. So it builds and builds and builds. I'll just skip ahead a little bit. So here it's starting to really get quite large. So I knew that I wanted that section to have a lot of impact, and so I was going to deliberately be quite restrained in the dynamics of the earlier part of the piece to achieve that. You can see here it's registered -7.4 as the maximum volume that was being hit on the master fader there. And that's about what I want. To me, as I was listening to that through the monitors, it sounded nice and full and exciting. So that's the main thing. Set your monitors at a level where loud is registering at -6 or -7 as a rule of thumb. So the way to do that is just play some audio through your DAW like I've just done here, or you could drag in some audio, you know, like a existing track from somewhere else. Turn down the volume either on the fader or on the region clip gain so that it's at a level which is hitting about -6 or 7 on the master fader, and then turn your monitors back up so that it then sounds full again. I would say for me personally, I'm obviously mindful of not wanting to crank the volume up too high. That's going to damage my hearing in the long term. But I do want, for the loud sections at my default monitoring level, for me, I want them to sound satisfying. So they need to feel like they're kind of enveloping me as a listener, because that's the effect that I'm trying to create. So if I'm trying to create big sounding music, but I'm not allowing my monitors to go above a certain level, it can be a bit counterproductive. But equally, if it's very easy to go overboard just because louder always sounds better. One thing to note then, if you're going to set your monitors up at a certain level and then aim to keep them at that level, it might require a bit of a change of habit. For example, I used to be very habitually accustomed to just cranking the volume if I'm listening to Spotify or YouTube or something to control the volume on my interface control, which is problematic because then you're constantly changing your monitoring level. So then when you dive back into Logic later, you don't quite know what level you're set at. So it's important to make that mental switch if you do go down this route to adjusting playback volumes on other apps using their software-based controls, like the little slider on YouTube or on Spotify or whatever. So the next thing I want to discuss is setting the level of a new instrument part as you introduce it into your arrangement in the course of a composing workflow. This is so crucial, and the two things that are working together here are the velocity, i.e. how strongly you play it in, assuming you're playing on a keyboard, as well as the overall gain or volume of the sound source. Those two things very much work together. The velocity is going to have a large impact on the tone of the instrument, but also the overall volume, of course. And the gain, or the level of the instrument itself, is going to largely determine where that's going to sit in the mix. So let me give you an example. Let's just play the intro of this track. And maybe let's imagine that I want to add a piano thing over the top, a little piano melody. We've already got a little echoey piano there, but say I want an actual top line melody on the piano. So what I'm going to do is create a new software instrument and just load up a piano. And got a piano sound here. Now, so the first thing I need to do is integrate this piano sound into the track, put it at an appropriate level based on how I want to play the instrument and also where I want it to sit in the mix. So in my head, I have this quite soft tone. I don't want it to sound like the pianist is really hammering away. I want it to feel quite gentle. So I know that I want to play something kind of at this kind of dynamic level on the keyboard so that I get that nice soft round tone. But I also know that it needs to sit nicely on top of the track. So I'm going to use a physical controller here that I've set up to control the overall instrument volume. So these two things, the velocity and the gain, are kind of working together to determine a rough volume. So I personally find it quite helpful to, by default, have a gain plugin on every instrument, basically, that I have saved in my presets. And as I say, I can just control that using a controller, and the way that you set that up is just by moving it with your mouse and then hitting Command L. And that will bring up the dialog that allows you to then assign it to a controller. By just taking that opportunity there and then to set the right level as you're kind of coming up with the idea and the material, just to kind of mix it as you go in a very sort of basic sense. Just for me, it really helps things come together a lot more quickly. So I've just put in this little line here. And I've actually taken a lot of the top end off using EQ just to help further place it in the mix. But now say I want my piano part later on in the track to do some big, bolder sounding bass notes. Probably the overall volume that I've set for this track using the gain plugin, and in this case also a bit of EQ, won't be appropriate later on. Say if I want to do a kind of boom, boom with the basses in the left hand or something. It's going to require a different volume setting because I'm going to want the sound of the piano being hit a bit harder, but I also don't want it to be super loud and just overwhelm the rest of the instruments. One thing that you could do is, for example, use automation to turn the volume down in a later part of the track, and then that gives you the freedom to hit a bit harder, say in this section. So we want to get it about here. Or, that feels about an appropriate volume. But for me personally, I don't really like using automation in this way. I'd much rather have each track in my Logic session kind of do one thing dynamically, even if it's the same instrument. My tendency is to do what they sometimes call multing. And so when it comes to this section down here, I'll do exactly what I did before, is I'll use my physical controller. Say I just want a big D on that downbeat. Just like that, for example. That's probably a bit too loud still, so I'm going to use my physical controller to just find a good level. So just so it does what I want it to do in the track. And I might rename this track Piano Bass, for example. And what I could also do is select both of these and press Shift Command D and create a summing stack and just call this Piano. And that's my piano track now, and I'm setting different volume levels on each of the tracks, but keeping the rest of the settings the same. I just find this is a cleaner way to work if I have the same instrument, but in different sections of the track, they need to be at slightly different levels or maybe have slightly different EQs. I would say for the majority of what I do, which is quite sort of naturalistic, instrument-based music, the default option is generally just to have one instrument per track and to control the dynamics, the levels, just with playing, with the velocities of the notes and so on, or with CC11 or CC1 if it's a string instrument or a wind instrument, a virtual instrument. But there are instances like the one we just discussed where it feels like you want to give the overall part a boost or bring it down a notch just so it fits with the overall context of the track. And in those cases, rather than using automation, I prefer to duplicate the track and set the overall track volume there. The automation method is fine. I just personally find that it generally requires more clicking and it can get a little bit messy when, especially if you're moving the material around. Having multiple tracks usually is a cleaner solution for me, so that's my default go-to. Let's now talk about controlling the dynamics in a live recorded part. In this piece, I don't actually have that much in terms of audio. I just have this Moog bass, which isn't a great example, so I'm going to quickly record in a vocal line just for demo purposes. Not quite, but something like that. So one thing we might think is, okay, when it gets up to the high note here, it really sort of pokes out a bit too much. First of all, let's set an overall level. Maybe give it a ton more reverb so it sounds vaguely acceptable. So say we like that as a kind of initial level, but then when we get to here, so we want to just reduce the volume of this section. So in my case, what I tend to do is use the marquee tool, which is set to my secondary instrument, hit Command to just slice the region there. And then there are two things. The kind of the logic default way to do it would be to use this box up here, just click and drag and adjust the volume until I'm happy with it. And so you could do this, at a broad level, but you could even do this, say one of these notes was a bit loud or you just wanted to de-emphasize maybe the first note. You can really micromanage things, and just go through and kind of basically do what a compressor would do, sort of by eye, although that's not the best. You want to be doing this with a kind of an audible intention. But and then once you've chopped them all up, you'd probably want to use a keyboard shortcut like Control-Option-X, which I think is the default. That's to apply default crossfade, which I've got set up to be quite small, and that just makes sure that all of the transitions are smooth. Or you could just drag with the fade tool by hitting T, A, do your fade, and then double T to get out of that. So that's how I would tend to do it. If it were not for the fact that I have another little secret weapon made by the same people who make Plug Search, which I mentioned in a previous video, called Gain Control. And Gain Control I find useful as just a very quick and dirty way of adjusting the overall volume of a region by using a keyboard shortcut, Shift, Command, and down in my case, and just allows you to do that, which I think is pretty standard behavior in things like Pro Tools, but for whatever reason, by the logic default, you can't assign that to a key command, I don't think. One thing with Gain Control is you can't multi-select, and then, if you multi-select regions and then do this gain drag thing, it keeps the relative volumes intact, whereas if you use Gain Control to do that, you lose that. As you can see, it's rejigged them. So Gain Control is very useful for just quickly grabbing one bit of the audio and turning it right down, incredibly quickly. You can see I've still got my fader at unity, i.e. at 0, and I've got 0 automation going on. And that's kind of how I like to leave things for the most part until we start to get into automation. So although I don't really like automation as a way of just sort of managing levels, I do like it very much as an expressive tool. And to that end, I tend to use it in combination with physical controllers. So as you can see, if I flick to the automation view here, the only place that I've got automation so far while working on this track is this bit here, which is the sort of arpeggio thing. And I've done a kind of fader ride. So it's an example of a dynamic change, a sort of a change across time, where that's the effect that I'm going for, or I could have clicked it in, like this. But for me, there's something very nice about using physical controls to create those kinds of waves of kind of just coming into the foreground and receding slightly back and kind of performing that almost like an instrument. So let me just demo that quickly. So first of all, I'm going to put the track into latch mode using a key command, Control Option A in my case. So here we go. And I find it's quite useful to shut my eyes. And just feel whether it should be louder or softer. I know that I want an overall build, but I also want some waves. And just by paying this much attention to detail, I find it creates a much more organic kind of feeling. Rather than if you just clicked in a straight line, And by shutting your eyes and allowing yourself to be immersed and to interact with the volume in such a tactile, simple way, I just find is really helpful to kind of exist in the world of the music with your imagination. One thing to note is if you find you're kind of getting stuck down the bottom of the fader because you're not wanting the track to poke out too much in the mix, then once again, using the gain plugin to set the overall volume, maybe just to turn the whole thing down a bit before you start doing that movement with the fader, can just help get things in the ballpark. You want to generally avoid being stuck down here too much because it's not a huge issue, but it's a bit low resolution at this part of the fader, whereas up here you get a lot more fine-grained control, with a smaller kind of physical movement. So I was probably a little low here, to be honest. I could have bumped the volume a bit. Let's quickly talk about a variant on this idea, which is instead of using the fader, to use a shelf EQ. This is just a thing that I personally find I do a lot as a kind of alternate and slightly different sounding way of making something feel more present or further away. Say we've got this high string line here, and I want it to just kind of fade in gradually into the track. Okay, so I'm going to use a shelf EQ to achieve this. So I'll put the track into latch mode, and I'm going to start with the shelf right down quite aggressively and then bring it in. So essentially I'm just bringing in the top frequencies in real time. Here we go. So that's just another way of essentially automating volume, but being a bit more specific about what frequency area you're affecting. So finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't touch on the topic of compression, which is obviously another way to shape dynamics. But for me, this is kind of the last thing that I think about with regards to managing volumes, which is really what I wanted to talk about in this video. For me, compression is, on the whole, for the kind of stuff that I write, which is sort of quite naturalistic instrumental music most of the time, I tend to think of compression as more of an effect, like a creative effect, the sound of compression, the sound of something being a bit squeezed or being a bit kind of fattened or something. It's more of like a tonal sculpting tool, I guess. When it comes to using compressors as a leveling tool or a kind of volume management tool, I tend to use them less because I like the sort of control and intentionality that comes with just using clip gain, for example, where I can just grab the quiet part and just bump the volume a little bit and be very intentional. With compression, I often find myself having like lots of side effects from one thing that I'm trying to do with the compressor. It ends up creating a lot of other changes that kind of by accident. So I guess my general philosophy has been with music production and with composition to try and make every step as intentional as possible. I guess I don't feel like I quite have the creative confidence in that area that I might have in other areas. And so most of the time I just try to get stuff leveled out in a more manual way, and then I leave it to an external mix engineer to do a bit of sweetening or a bit of fattening with the compression process. So that's been my kind of personal approach. But of course, it really depends what you're interested in and what excites you and what aspects of music and audio production you really connect with. That's all for this video. I hope that was illuminating. Again, not trying to offer sort of general advice, more just sharing my personal kind of working philosophy with regards to controlling volumes in the context of composing music. So let me know any questions that you have. I'd be curious always to hear how you guys work and whether you think that there are any improvements that could be made from the way that you've seen me work. And yeah, all that remains to say is thanks very much for your attention. See you on the next video.